welcome back. We talk a lot about the headlines of the day, and one of the questions that has popped up, what has happened to feminism? Big question in today's culture. I am so honored to have with us today Janice Fiamengo. She is a retired professor of English, also an author and cultural commentator. She earned her doctorate degree from the University of British Columbia and taught at the University of Ottawa for more than 2 decades, and once an advocate of feminism herself. She now writes and speaks about the cultural impact through her book called The Goddess That Failed, and also known as the Fiamengo Files, which series. And you can go to her Substack, substack.com/ Fiamengo File, and that's spelled Fiamengo File. And there's a picture of that landing page. Wow, okay, a lot going on. Professor, good to see you. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your program.
Well, a lot to talk to you about, a short amount of time. Tell us your story. What happened? How did you go from one to the other?
I just saw that it wasn't true. When I was doing my doctorate, I was surrounded by people who affirmed my understanding of feminism, that it was a movement for social justice that was based on real, measurable problems, and that the history of humankind was indeed the history of men oppressing women, in particular white men oppressing women and other vulnerable peoples. I had been taught, I had read that the United States of America is the worst country in the world, an oppressor nation, an exterminationist nation, imperialistic, misogynistic, white supremacist, etc., and that I should align myself with the enemies of America, all of whom had superior systems of government and who taught dealt with their citizens in more just ways. And I think when you're surrounded by people who believe those things, it's easy to accept until you actually begin to look around at the real world. And once I began teaching at university, I couldn't help but see that it wasn't the case. And I began to think about what it must be like to be a young man sitting in course after course, sitting in university classrooms, being told by pretty much everybody who taught that young man that his sex was responsible for all the evil of the world, that his sex had done nothing good, and that his only role now in a just society was to apologize for his alleged privilege, even though he could look around and see that he wasn't privileged, that in all sorts of ways he was being disadvantaged in, affirmative action programs and special perks and all sorts of ways in which women were being advantaged. But he was to apologize for his privilege, to accept the burden of guilt for historical oppression, and take a step back and let his morally superior sisters and colleagues lead the world into a glorious future in which all suffering would cease and the social order would be placed on a better footing.
Wow.
And, I thought that was a terribly unjust and damaging message to convey to young men, and also, of course, to the young women who are taught that they're victims, that they should consider everything in their lives as a result of that victimization, that they should dwell in their resentment, their envy, their sense of grievance, that their bitterness was fully justified, and that, in fact, their right to take revenge on the alleged oppressors, and to feel very little empathy for those who fall into the oppressor category.
Wow. Was that an aha moment, or did that evolve?
Well, it kind of started with September 11th, I have to say. I had been teaching for a year at that point, and to witness the mood of sort of quiet exultation and vaunting that I felt throughout the university where I was working was sickening and terrifying. I realized that I was part of a group of people that were very enthusiastic about their hatred And so that was the beginning, really, of my journey away from the left in general, away from social justice ideology. And I had already become skeptical of feminist claims at that point, but I began to investigate feminist claims more deeply, and just to notice the the hatred, the if you're looking at a movement and the leaders of that movement, celebrated, admired, and applauded, express overt hatred for a group of people, and even articulate very clearly their desire to see that group demeaned, punished, and even in some cases exterminated. And I'm not talking about fringe radicals, working in the far dark corners of the internet. I'm talking about social leaders, university professors. If you see a movement like that that claims it cares about liberation and claims that that it's working for gender equality, you have to really wonder, what kind of deception is being practiced on the public.
So,
And so I started to read what feminists had to say, and what they have to say is appalling. And I think everybody should be more aware of that.
wow. So was it the anger and the hate that kind of grabbed your heart?
Yes, absolutely. I when I signed on to the feminist revolution, I didn't realize that I was going to be asked to hate my father and young men that I taught in my classrooms. And I also didn't realize that I was going to be signed on to a movement that doesn't like freedom of speech, that doesn't like equality before the law, that doesn't believe in the presumption of innocence, and that doesn't believe that fathers are just as important to their children as mothers.
Okay. How are you received among your colleagues today?
Well, I am retired, and but I began speaking out on these issues about more than 10 years ago. I think I gave my first talk in the fall of 2012. So for the last 7 years of my academic career, I was an anti-feminist advocate. My colleagues were very kind and civil to me, but I think personally they, quietly, they believed that I was a kook. The academy is a thoroughly feminist compliant sphere. No dissent from its ideological tenets is allowed.
Your title of your book says a lot, The Goddess That Failed. Where it is today, feminism today, and once where you were a part of, it seems to be failing rapidly. And in fact, it's almost taken on another image, especially with the trans movement. How would you describe it today?
Well, I would actually argue that it has always been contaminated by anti-male animus, that it's always been warped by its utopian longings and by its conviction of female moral superiority. If you go back all the way to, 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, but in the American context, especially Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was the leader of the American feminist movement for about 50 years, she authored an important document and convened the first women's rights conference in the United States, which was held at Seneca Falls in New York. And she authored the Declaration of Sentiments that was modeled on the Declaration of Independence. And it was the statement of what this allegedly equal rights movement was all about. I would really encourage everyone to go and read that document. It's widely available on the internet, the Declaration of Sentiments, and it starts off by saying that the history of humankind has been the history of repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of man against woman, having as its direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. It's a pretty fire-breathing statement. It does not evidence any gratitude or recognition of the male role in building a civilization that cared about women and children. Men and women attended this conference, and men signed this Declaration of Sentiments, which goes on to list all the alleged injustices and injuries that men have, allegedly perpetrated against women. Many of them are untrue. It talks about how men, for example, have denied women the opportunity to have a higher education. Many of the signers of that document must have known it wasn't true. Elizabeth Cady Stanton herself had been educated at the elite Troy Seminary, which was established in, I think, the late teens of the 19th century in order to guarantee female students an education that was equivalent with men. Oberlin College, for example, had opened its doors to women in 1837, and many other institutions of higher education had done the same in the years afterwards. So we're talking about a declaration in 1848 that made claims about women's universal oppression that were not even true at the time. And as the years went on after that declaration, many of the alleged injuries were remedied by all male parliaments and male voters who were very keen to listen to women's demands and women's complaints, to act to alleviate any injustices that women claimed they were suffering under. So that is really the thing that matters most to me, is that feminism from the beginning has lied about the condition of men and women in American society. And I don't see how we can believe what feminists claim today when we know that the entire history of the movement has been based on dishonesty. So, but to go to your question about what feminism is all about today, it has become an ever more radical movement aligned with Marxism, stating overtly its hatred. Leaders like Robin Morgan have said that the oppressed have a right to class hatred against the class that is oppressing them. A professor named Susanna Walters wrote in 2018 an op-ed in the Washington Post called "Why Can't We Hate Men?" She teaches young men. She makes judgments about male colleagues every day at the university, and yet she has made clear that she believes an entire class of human beings should be discriminated against simply because they were born male. This is not at all unusual. There was a professor named Sally Miller Gearhart who actually, and again, this is a university professor, not a wacko writing an internet blog. She advocated that the number of men should be reduced to 10% of the human population through new reproductive technologies, and that this would be the way to guarantee peace and prosperity in the future. So we've come to the point now where men and women, or where feminists cannot even, of course, define what a woman is, and who teach women that the worst slavery is to marry and to bear children. This is based on Engels' book from 1884, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, which was based on Karl Marx's papers after he died, in which the situation of a woman in marriage was directly compared to the situation of the oppressed worker under capitalism.
All right, let me take a quick break here. The book is entitled The Goddess That Failed, and also she has what they call the Fiamengo files available. Then you can go to substack.com/Fiamengo file, and that's spelled Fiamengo file. There's a picture of that landing page. Let me take a quick break. We'll have more for the professor when we come back. All right, welcome back. What an honor to have with us today Dr. Janice Fiamengo, professor of English, retired from the University of Ottawa. She's written a book that is fascinating, The Goddess That Failed. By the way, where can they get the book?
Anywhere where you buy books, Amazon, all the other outlets.
Okay, check it out. And then she has substack.com/Fiamengo file, and that is the landing page there. Gosh, I have a big question and little time, so I'm going to have to get you back. This is fascinating. I think the anger-hate issue is just such a You've clarified so many things in my own mind about that. But overall, feminism's attack on men, fatherhood, young men today, dealing with depression and loneliness, and ultimately the biblical definition of feminism, masculinity, and family is all thrown under the bus. I wonder if we understand this.
Yes, I think when I speak to most men about feminism, I think many men, most men, the vast majority, have a heart for women in general and especially love the women in their lives. And when I ask them what they think of, when they think of feminism, they usually think of equality and stopping the mistreatment of women. And men are very much on board with that. I've never met a man who didn't want to see a woman be able to fulfill her dreams if she is capable of making some kind of contribution to her society. I've never met a man who wanted that to be taken away from her. When I speak to women about feminism and their sense of gender relations, I notice that there is quite a lot of resentment. There's a general sense that women have been a historically oppressed class. Many women believe false ideas that have been spread by feminism, all sorts of things like that women couldn't get credit cards before 1974, or that women couldn't have their own bank accounts, all sorts of falsehoods. And of course, terrible statistics about sexual assault and sexual harassment and abuse in marriage and domestic violence, etc. And I think that has really done damage to both young men and women in some of the ways we've talked about, and in a general inability on the part of women to recognize men and boys as hurting people who also suffer. As you said, there's a terrible problem with loneliness. Many men are retreating from the world. They've been told that their masculinity is toxic. Some of them have been told that by their mothers. I have a chapter on that. Their experiences of discrimination, for example, in equity hiring and diversity policies, are not recognized. The attitude is that men have had it too good for too long, and now it's their turn to step back and maybe even suffer a bit because they deserve it. A lot of young women are bitter and angry. They're taught to rage. They're taught to act out, not to control their feelings. It's the opposite of what we should be doing. So in all sorts of ways, we're miseducating our young people and preventing what is the most natural and civilization founding act of all, which is young men and women coming together to create families and to build stable homes for their children. Men are told that their desire for that is somehow wrong. Women are told that it's a form of slavery that they should put off for as long as possible or avoid altogether. And what we find in surveys now is that many young women have a very low opinion of men. Men don't have a low opinion of women in general. They have a very high opinion of them. And that about half the number of young women want to marry and have children as young men do. So this is a serious problem for our future.
So let me ask you a quick question. As you well know, men playing in women's sports, they're trying to disguise it as trans, but the point is, why are women allowing that if they hate men so much?
Well, there is a rift within feminism over that issue, and I think the potentially positive impact is that some feminists are starting to be alarmed as they watch their daughters, have their volleyball team invaded by boys who are much stronger and can cause significant harm to girls or whatever type of sport it happens to be. So not all feminists are in favor of it. Academic feminists tend to be, and those who aren't directly impacted by it. Right. But it is starting a conversation about the reality of biology. But this is something that feminists have denied for many, many years. And one of the ironies of this present transgender phenomenon is that many women are angry And they think this is a new form of patriarchy. I've actually read articles with that as in the title or in the argument, that men are usurping women's spaces. They're taking over women's identities and women's bodies, and they are very angry about that. Okay. What they don't acknowledge is that if it hadn't been for feminism, the entire trans phenomenon would have been impossible. It was feminists starting in the 1970s who very emphatically pressed the case that there is no relationship between gender identity and sex, that there is nothing natural about femininity, that women are just performing scripts. There's no natural difference between the sexes. Kate Millett in Sexual Politics in 1970 said that explicitly. By the time we're into the late 1980s, transgenderism and the performance of gender subversion is being celebrated by feminists as a way to overturn an oppressive gender order. So the trans phenomenon grows directly out of the feminist attempt to subvert gender, allegedly to liberate us all. And the last thing I would say about that is that although I am very sympathetic to those moms and those female athletes who are now seeing their dreams of competing at a high level in sport destroyed, I wish those same people who are now protesting the entry of biological males into women's sport would also look at some of the many spheres in which women invaded men's domains to the detriment of us all. For example, into the spheres of firefighting, policing, soldiering, where because of feminist demands, the standards were lowered, physical requirements were in some cases simply taken away altogether, so that in the name of equality, women could join these various domains. This is terrible because it means that women are being hurt. They do not have the upper body strength, for example, to do the tasks that are involved in firefighting. Many of them are now on injury leave because of their inability to perform the work. Okay. It's dangerous for the men they work with who have to pick up the slack, and it's dangerous for the public when they can't perform their roles properly. Right. So I would like to see a widespread protest, not only against men invading women's spheres, but also against women invading men's spheres where they don't belong and can't compete.
Doctor, I'm out of time, but let me say to our viewers and listeners, The Goddess That Failed, you can get it available there at online at Amazon. Can we get you back? You're fascinating.
I would love to come back. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think you've touched on so many things here that we can go a little bit deeper on, but
I'd love to.
Thank you for being honest to yourself and sharing that honesty with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, God bless. Bye-bye.